We were going to ask what to do with the Browns and the trend of these hires, but I am curious what you think about Matt Rhule, because you have done a lot of Big 12 games, right?
Yeah, ironically, I've never done one with Matt Rhule. Now, I've obviously come to know him in passing and just some different things where we've run into each other. Studied a lot of his film from opponents who had played him that I was preparing for. Look, he's a great coach, a great leader of men. He develops young men, and you could see that at Temple. You could see that at Baylor. The difficulty is in the NFL is to some degree you're kind of required to do that, but really it's more about scheme. It's more about, how you find edges within the talent that you have, because most teams have a lot of talent, whether they're household names or not in the NFL. One thing that stood out to me, though, especially when you watched them at Baylor this past year, was they were a very sound football team. And this wasn't a team that necessarily could recruit either at Baylor or even at Temple with the likes of some of the top, teams within that conference. And so they had to play sound football. It couldn't be penalized much. They couldn't turn the football over. They had to play very, very tough, stingy defense, and they did all of those things. So I think his experience with that and giving his past NFL coaching experience, he understands what it takes, and I think he can make that happen at every level. It just is going to take time, and I think that's what you see that David Tepper did. He gave him a 7-year, $62.5 million contract, up to $70 million with incentives for what I've seen recently.
Okay. So in other words, I mean, this is a perfectly fair take on it, and I think this is what everybody should have a take on. It's like, you like the hire, he fits the bill for what the Panthers need, but you don't actually know if it's going to work out, because you know what? We never know if coaches are going to work out. There's never a guarantee a coach is going to work out.
No, I mean, wouldn't you think Nick Saban would have worked out? I mean, I would have thought that. I would have thought when he went to the Dolphins, things would have went right. Obviously, they didn't. A lot of things went wrong. So there's a lot of times you kind of look at a situation and think, well, this is going to work. This is going to make sense. And it just doesn't work out the way you anticipate. I think Josh McDaniels is always a, top candidate, because people look at his offense and say, wow, he could call plays, he can find production, he gets the most wherever he goes. But for whatever reason, it didn't work, during his time there at Denver. And, he's been selective with what he wants to do next, because I think he realizes you only get a couple shots at it in the NFL. After the second time, you're very, very lucky or fortunate if you get a third. So, I think it's tough to be able to predict, because there's so many variables. I mean, look at if you're a head coach in Cleveland, which they don't have their head coach, but whatever Jimmy and Dee Haslam are selling you right now, a year later, they could be telling you something else. I mean, we saw that in 2013. We saw that last year with Freddie Kitchens. And so a lot of things can change. A lot of things can impact, your ability to be able to actually win football games and be successful.
Brady, let me ask you this, sort of talking about all the coaches. I like Matt Rhule from the outside looking in, and actually on paper, I like Joe Judge from the outside looking in, knowing nothing about him. And here's why. I feel like they have the ability to be CEOs, and I think we've seen in recent years, maybe even longer than that you need to be more of a CEO than an X's and O's guru as an offensive or defensive coordinator in order to have success as a head coach. How do you feel about that? Is it more important to be able to manage people and delegate that authority to your assistants, or do you have to be Andy Reid and know every single thing that's going on offensively, for example, in order for your team to be successful?
I think it depends on what your comfort zone is. Now, Andy Reid's done it long enough where this is his second stint as a head coach, and so I think he's got a good handle on not only calling plays, and he has help with Eric Bieniemy and the other people on their staff. But I think the other thing is he's got experience being able to manage it all. If that was your first time, taking on a head coaching job like a la Sean McVay, where you're calling plays and trying to be head coach, that's a daunting task. But if you looked at his staff, between Fossil and then Phillips, even though now he's not with the organization any longer, he had guys who were experienced that they could control, that phase or that particular part of the team. So, for as far as, what makes the most sense, I tend to always lean on like the best head coaches end up being the ones that just manage people and lead, and they understand how to kind of, handle all of that that comes with it. I tend to think those guys end up having more sustained success, and they do a better job of building a culture. I know we talk about that a ton, but if you're always focused on scheme and your personnel, putting them in certain spots, and your opponent, you're never really concerned with, what is happening with some of the young men and what's going on within your team in all three phases. And sometimes you can let some things slip, or you can be ignorant to some things because you didn't have that vantage point. I think him stepping into the role that he's going to be stepping into as head coach and not necessarily focusing on too much on one side or the other, he can have that bird's eye view and be able to see things maybe before they even develop and stop them and correct them or get them the way he wants. So that's one thing that I think Matt Rhule has in his favor, as does Joe Judge, who obviously is going to have to, hire an offensive coordinator and defensive coordinator because that's just not his background, even though he has coached on both sides of the football. But I like the hire, and I think more teams should look at special teams coordinators as candidates because if you think about their job, what it entails, you touch both sides of the team as far as offense and defense, and on top of it, your job is really predicated on situational football and situational awareness. How oftentimes do we hammer head coaches for not handling end-of-game situations very well or managing the clock or those scenarios? If you're a special teams coordinator, that's essentially part of your job, one of the key components. Being able to talk to the entire team, knowing what each side is really dealing with, but then also understanding the situation. So Joe Judge makes a lot of sense. Even though he's not very well known, he came highly recommended by Bill Belichick. And obviously he was a young coach who Bill Belichick delegated that task to, which is very seldom you ever see in New England. And then finally, he knocked it out of the park in his interviews with the New York Giants front office. I spoke to a couple people that I know there. They were extremely impressed by him, so much so, which is one of the reasons why, even though Carolina got the jump on Matt Rhule, I don't think the Giants were that upset considering the way Joe Judge handled things. And then also the fact that Matt Rhule kind of rubbed them the wrong way, wanting to take a vacation after the bowl game, not wanting to come immediately to interview with them and talk with them about the job more.
Really?
Yeah.
That bugged him? I mean, I understand why that would kind of bug them, but
well, if it's supposedly your dream job, wouldn't you think that after that game's done with, maybe you then take a couple days off, not almost a week, to go to Mexico and or you continue the conversations?
I mean, we've got a vacation planned like at some point after the season, and if I bump it back for work-related purposes, my wife is going to stab me in the face. So, I mean, maybe there's something that I don't know. Like,
I'll put it this way: Jason Garrett was basically a dead man walking. He knew he was going to get fired. He still hung around and was politicking to try to keep that job because he didn't want to have to potentially go somewhere else to coach. So obviously that, in a way, is an example of it being Jason's dream job that he didn't want to leave. And you've got a guy who supposedly has his dream job lined up, and the Giants maybe wanting to commit to him, maybe not to this extent of David Tepper, but still he decided to go on a vacation. And look, that's part of who he is. He's got balance. He cares about his family. Maybe he wanted to mull over the decision. And there's nothing wrong with that because much like we saw with the Colts and Frank Reich or even Doug Peterson and the Eagles, sometimes your first choice doesn't mean it's necessarily the best choice for you. Sometimes it works out better with someone else.
Yeah, that's fair. All right, what about the hiring season SZN, of course, as all the kids say, as a whole? Are you – because, last year we sort of saw – I mean, there only been 5 hires so far, right? Or no, there have been 4 hires? How many hires have there been? I can't – 5 firings, 4 hirings. Cleveland
right, still Cleveland. That's right.
Yeah. 2 retreads in terms of Ron Rivera and Mike McCarthy hired. 1 stable college guy in terms of Matt Rhule. And then, of course, Joe Judge, who – I mean, look, again, a very different – I don't want to call him he's a first-time coordinator hire, but it doesn't feel like all right, here's the best offensive coordinator of the year. Whereas, like, last year, it was such a clear, aggressive approach on offensive-minded coaches, whether it was like Freddie Kitchens, Adam Gase, Bruce Arians, Cliff Kingsbury came from college. Gase and Arians were retreads, but then you had Kitchens, Vic Fangio was defensive, Matt LaFleur, Zach Taylor, Brian Flores. I mean, not all those guys are offensive, but like a lot of young offensive minds or a lot of offensive minds in general. Do you see a trend here where it's like, feels like after some people felt burnt by 1-year hirings that they're trying to go a little more stable here?
I think what we saw from the Miami Dolphins and Brian Flores maybe played a bit of a factor on what you're seeing organizations do now, where they just looked for, hey, who's the best candidate? Like, who's the best leader of men? Who's the best guy to be the head coach of our football team? Let's not just make this about the quarterback position because, as you see with Freddie Kitchens, for example, continuity only goes so far with the offense and the play caller and keeping him and Baker Mayfield on the same page. It really didn't benefit that team at all because they had other areas that they really needed to address, and they didn't because they were so focused on keeping that relationship with Freddie and Baker. And it ended up being, to some degree, the demise of their season because Baker didn't have a good season. The O-line needed, more attention, more love. The wide receivers never really got on the same page with Baker, and the defense wasn't the way it needed to be, and obviously without its best player for a certain portion of the season because he was taking other players' helmets and beating them in the head with it. So that to me was like a glowing example of probably should be careful about putting too much weight or all your eggs in that basket, worrying about like the development of the quarterback. I mean, look at Sean McVay in this past year when they were like, maybe this offense isn't that great if they don't have Todd Gurley working the way he needs to, or the wide receivers are hurt. Then all of a sudden Jared Goff's not playing that well. Like maybe it's about more than just this position. So I think you looked at an organization like Washington, an organization like Dallas that said, we want a good leader, a guy who's got a built-in track record, he's got experience. We don't want to have to go through growing pains. We feel like we've got some pieces in place to build from now and not have to kind of worry about a what if. And then I think you see other organizations that base it off of, who they feel like is the best possible, or potential candidate. And that also falls in line with the Dallas Cowboys and Mike McCarthy. He's got a Super Bowl under his belt, great win percentage during his time in Green Bay. And now that we've gotten like a look at, by the way, Aaron Rodgers with Matt LaFleur's offense, I just keep going back to this. Like you look at the best 5-year span in Rodgers' career, it's obviously with Mike McCarthy there. And so we can make whatever we want of, them not winning more, but I think that's to move more with the team. And you might want to put more pressure on Ted Thompson for not doing more in free agency to supplement that team as opposed to purely sticking with the draft. And maybe handcuffing them at times as far as playing a factor in them not winning more. But my point is this. I think there's been a little bit of a correction to what we saw last year. And now teams are looking for who they feel like is the right guy and not just the right guy for a certain position.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was talking about earlier. And Brady mentioned leaders of men. And that brings me to my favorite talking point when it comes to NFL things. Mike Tomlin and Sean McDermott, baby. William and Mary, two great leaders of men who aren't necessarily X's and O's guys. They're both defensive guys, but what they've been able to do both in Pittsburgh and in Buffalo is build a culture, have their players buy in, and I think that's more important. I think that's sort of what Brady was saying in part than having just the X's and O's guys. And I will give you a perfect example. His name is quarterbacks guru Adam Gase. I don't think that's worked out for Adam Gase in New York. I don't think it worked out in Miami. And I don't know if he's head coaching material, even though he seems to be up 23 hours a day scheming up offensive game plans. Another guy, and Brady's actually talked about this before, is Pete Carroll, who I think is 68 years old now. But Brady's talked about how excited it was just he made people seem about spring training, about training camp practices. And I feel like he still connects with those players and they want to play for him. And on some level, that's more important than calling the right play at the right moment.